The following program may contain black bars, dated graphics, and/or in-depth analyses. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to the pilot for Necronalysis. My name is Atraitus, and I'm here to investigate MechCommander Gold, a game that was made by FASA Interactive and released by Microprose in 1999. MechCommander is a real-time tactics game, even though it's often miscategorized as a real-time strategy game. In this game, the player takes a company of mech warriors from green recruits to an elite fighting force, and the player fights a very uphill battle with inferior technology, soldiers that can't hit the broadside of a barn, and very little in terms of resources. It is heavily reliant on capturing new battle mechs and weapon systems, as well as not taking too much damage on currently owned mechs, not losing weapons that you already have, training up mech warriors, and not letting those same mech warriors die. The entire time, the player is a massive underdog. Now, I'm not going to go into the very involved Battletech backstory here, as I'm going to assume that at this point anyone who's interested already knows it. However, if you don't, and you're interested, much of the story is on the Battletech Wiki at sarna.net, or you could read the rather large amount of novels. In MechCommander, as indeed in pretty much all Battletech games, the story is largely irrelevant, albeit oddly fascinating, but I digress. Let's return to MechCommander. This game is one that I've played before many times. I grew up on MechCommander, and thus it holds a soft spot in my heart. However, before starting work on this video, I hadn't played it in between 5 and 10 years, somewhere in there. I chose to cover this game first because I wanted to see how it holds up to my fond memories, and how well it holds up in comparison to more modern games. So let's just dive in and figure out how it works, how it doesn't, and how it could work better.
Command interface initiate. Incoming transmission.
MechCommander is heavily based on the tabletop wargame Battletech, beyond just inheriting the setting. It's, in essence, a simplified version of the wargame, translated from turn-based into real-time tactics, and it does a decent, if not amazing, job of this. It has 7 core mechanics: equipping mechs, planning your force, movement, combat, the damage model, salvaging and exploration, and persistent damage. In MechCommander, the player is limited merely by the maximum weight a battle mech can carry. This is a rather significant departure from Battletech, where the most easily accessed battle mechs couldn't be altered at all, and only the much more rare Omni-Mech had that capability. In MechWarrior games that came out in the future, and I'm drawing primarily from MechWarrior 4 Mercenaries here, battle mechs had a hardpoint system, where only certain types of weapons could go into certain slots. This served to force the player into equipping ballistic and missile weapons. There's no such system in MechCommander, which allows any weaponry on any mech, as long as it's not too heavy. I found the weapon balance in MechCommander to be rather off. I had remembered from my youth that particle projector cannons, or PPCs, were good. Very good. Upon investigation, I discovered that pulse lasers, well, the ones that were medium-ranged or higher, were equivalent to or better than the standard PPC. The extended range PPC, abbreviated to ER-PPC, did the same amount of damage per second as the PPC at a much higher weight, although it did the damage at a longer range. The clan ER-PPC had less weight, the same recycle time, and nearly double the damage. As pulse lasers had a faster recycle time but less overall damage, their damage per second worked out to be greater than or equal to the PPC and ER-PPC at overall less weight, allowing me to mount additional weapons. Their faster recharge time meant that misses, of which there are many, mech warriors are really bad at aiming, have less of an effect on the outcome of the battle. Thus I deduced that pulse lasers are better than every other energy weapon except the clan ER-PPC, which is the best weapon in the game, assuming that you can hit with it. When the expansion was introduced, it came with a new type of pulse laser, the large X pulse laser. This weapon outstripped even the clan ER-PPC, and was just better than everything else. Generally speaking, energy weapons have a longer recycle or recharge time than ballistic or missile weapons, but ballistic and missile weapons are both limited by ammunition, in some cases extremely severely limited. The heavy autocannon and Gauss rifles are prime examples of this. Only a handful of shots to bring into the mission, and the player has no control whatsoever of their accuracy. They're very high-risk weapons, and while they deal an extreme amount of damage, I found their usefulness to be limited next to the energy weapons available, which had no such ammunition shortages. The risk-reward just wasn't there. In Battletech and most of its derived games, energy weapons have a major drawback, that being their heat generation. Too much heat and a mech will shut down, or its fusion reactor will go critical. MechCommander has no such drawback, and based on that, I determined the usefulness of ballistic weapons in particular to be almost nil. Missile weapons do have the advantage of not requiring a direct line of sight, but the lack of indirect fire never really impaired me significantly. I just adjusted my approach vectors to compensate, and there were no problems. MechCommander also does not allow the player to modify the speed of their mechs or their armor value, instead simply allowing the player to pick between one of 3 static variants. The A-type, which has extra armor, the W, which can equip extra weapons, and the J, which has jump jets that allow it to fly over obstacles. Once the player has acquired a mech of a certain variant, that particular mech can't be changed between the variants. The intent was clearly for the types of weapons to be taken into account and modified based on the needs of the mission the player was on. I simply ignored that aspect, took the highest damage per second weapons, and maneuvered carefully to ensure constant line of sight on my targets. However, I did carefully plan what mechs I would bring on particular missions. There were several factors I had to consider in that planning. I had to consider how mobile my forces had to be. There were some missions that had to be completed in a certain, rather short, amount of time. There were others that were a slow-paced base assault. Some missions required interception of trains or convoys, or escorting particularly stubborn ambulances. One mission required capturing of a base in the opening minutes of the mission, but I had to keep its defenses intact in order to defend it against the many incoming enemies. So some missions allowed the slow-moving, heavily armed and armored heavy and assault mechs, and some missions required the faster, weaker light and medium mechs. The missions presented were incredibly diverse, and all were unique and had unusual challenges. And then I had to consider the weight limit. Each mission does not allow the player to go above a certain weight threshold, and each mech has a defined weight. That forced me into tough situations, such as capturing a base with a lance, that's Battletech's term for a squad, it means 4 mechs. A lance of light mechs that then discover the base is being defended by heavier mechs. It also forced me to choose between bringing the maximum number of mechs or bringing a few heavier mechs. Always a difficult decision. Finally, I had to carefully plan how I would approach the objective. Each mission presents the player with a map detailing the geography, and the player has full knowledge of the land going in. Once the mission begins, however, the fog of war descends and covers the map until it is explored. Each mission tends to have many options for approaching the objective. I had to choose between fighting my way to a bridge and crossing a river in time to intercept a convoy, or I could simply take weaker jump jet capable troops to jump across the river and attack the convoy directly. All of these factors, combined with equipping your forces for the battle at hand, meant that I was spending a sizable amount of time planning between missions. On average, it was about 8 minutes. Sometimes my plan turned out to be a really bad idea, and I had to abort the mission to try again. Once the player has planned out their strategy and started the mission, the actual game starts. Movement happens like in most RTS or RTT games, with the player selecting the units to move and then clicking where the unit should move. In MechCommander, this can be at one of 2 speeds, walking or running. Every mech walks at the same speed, but the running speed ranges fairly significantly. As far as I can tell, there's no real benefit to walking in MechCommander. It's possible that it makes firing somewhat more accurate, although it's not really noticeable if it does. The only thing it does do is it makes all your mechs move at the same speed, which is irrelevant if you're moving them to a safe location anyway. In Battletech, running has a significant heat drawback, but of course there's no heat mechanic in MechCommander. Kiting is something that is possible in MechCommander, but it seems to not be an intended use for the movement system. Mechs can fire while moving, but can't fire behind themselves. They can fire in roughly a 160-degree arc in a forward direction. When attempting to kite, the mech takes a while to reorient itself to a firing position, allowing the opponent to close to range and rendering the whole exercise very nearly moot. It's not entirely useless, but it's pretty difficult to do. Combat in general is pretty simplistic. While the expansion made it possible to aim at specific points, such as the cockpit or legs, the to-hit modifier makes the chances so low it's not even really worth it. You can specify a range, short, medium, or long, but because the mech warrior will only back slowly away and treat your order as guidelines more than rules, you're probably better off microing their position. You can order them to attack from position, simply attack, at which point they will close to short range unless you micro, or with the expansion you can order them to attack in ammo conservation mode, or only using energy weapons, which is what you should probably have anyway. Your mech warriors start as really terrible shots. They couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. By the time you max out their gunnery stat, they're merely poor shots, missing maybe a third of the time. As far as I can tell, the random hit chance doesn't take motion from the firing mech or target into account, so there doesn't seem to be much of a reason to micro beyond simple range exploitation. If two mechs have a similar range, it's likely their combat will just turn into a turret match. As a whole, the damage model, however, works pretty well. Weapons can damage both arms and both legs individually, and the left, center, and right torso, the left, center, and rear, and the cockpit. Losing one leg will cripple your mech, and losing two will cause your mech warrior to eject, as they can no longer move. Losing the center torso or center rear will also cause your mech warrior to eject because a core breach is imminent, and mech warriors don't really like nuclear explosions. If you lose your mech's cockpit, that will almost definitely kill your pilot, and you won't be able to get him or her back. Because you can't define where on your mech the weapons are though, it seems to be somewhat random when weapons are lost. At one point, all of my weapons on a light Raven mech were lost because the left torso was destroyed. Nothing else had any damage. The game either randomly destroys weapons when a section is destroyed, or it randomly assigns weapons to certain sections. I'm honestly not sure how it handles that one. Additional mechs and components can be acquired from two primary sources. One is from Battalion Requisitions in the Purchasing tab, in between missions. This is both expensive and very limited in its selection. The primary source of mechs and components is Salvage, and really, Salvage is the primary focus of the game. Mechs can only be captured in one way. If their core is breached and they explode, the mech isn't salvageable. If the core isn't breached, however, the mech can be repaired and is salvaged for use in later missions. This is a bit random, as the system for aiming at specific points isn't particularly useful. Shooting out the legs is a great way to salvage a mech, but it's very difficult to do. Most of the time, salvage just happens by accident. Although I replayed a few missions several times for different mech salvage outcome, and finally managed to capture a critical Mad Cat in the third mission. Components, on the other hand, can be captured in two ways. If a mech that is salvaged had components on it that weren't destroyed, which again seems to be random, those same components can then be stripped off of the mech and used on other mechs. The second method is more straightforward, though. There are several variants of buildings in MechCommander that can be captured, including things like turret controls, gate controls, and resource buildings. When you capture a resource building, you get predefined components from that building in your salvage. These were defined by FASA when they wrote the mission, so you won't be finding the strongest weapon in the game in the first mission, and it's the same every time you play the mission. Once you finish your mission, you will discover that the damage your mechs sustained is persistent and must be repaired using your scant currency, RP. As a side note, I don't know why they went for RP when there was a perfectly good currency in-universe already, the C-Bill. It simply would have required a rename of the currency, and everything else could have worked as is. But mechs could also be repaired in mission, if you brought along a rather limited repair truck, or if the mission had also limited repair bays in it. A player's mechs that are destroyed aren't lost, even though their core does get breached, but instead must be repaired at a much higher cost than non-destroyed mechs. Components lost in mission, by contrast, must be replaced as they cannot be recovered. Mech warriors that took damage during a mission will heal 1 damage from a maximum of 6 health per mission completion. A player can take damaged mechs or injured mech warriors on a mission, but they're much more likely to have the mech be destroyed or the mech warrior killed, and a killed mech warrior cannot be recovered, short of loading a save. Some mech warriors are more skilled than others, and this means that hard-earned training can be lost, sometimes without time left in the campaign to recover it. In that situation, you're pretty screwed. These 7 mechanics, equipping mechs, planning your force, movement, combat, the damage model, salvaging and exploration, and persistent damage, all contribute to the theme of the game. It's focused heavily on salvage, on slowly improving your forces, and on maintaining minimal acceptable losses. It's focused on efficient engagements, on using the terrain to your advantage, and on maintaining control. Nearly every mechanic serves these focuses, with the possible exception of the randomness of damage, of moving, and of combat. Generally speaking, though, these mechanics mesh together very well, and they create a truly interesting game. MechCommander holds up surprisingly well. Although the pre-rendered graphics and rather low-fidelity sound design feel pretty dated, they serve their purpose in conveying information. The music, although of a low audio quality, is well composed and remains interesting. The game itself is really quite fun and surprisingly compelling. I replayed several missions to attain better outcomes, and will continue playing the campaign after this video goes up. The game is pretty challenging on regular difficulty. On easy difficulty, the game is, well, very easy. On hard difficulty, though, the game is nearly impossible, so the difficulty options seem to have something for most people. The difficulty choices change the amount of damage your mechs deal and take, and don't seem to change anything relating to the mission, such as the amount of enemies that spawn, or your weight limit, or anything like that. That all stays the same. I remembered the missions as being much more lengthy from my youth. I was surprised to find they only took 10 to 20 minutes apiece to complete, some as few as 5 or 6. It's really an excellent game to pick up, play for 20 minutes, and put down, as the mission-based system adds natural stopping points. MechCommander is almost exactly how I remember it, and that's fairly impressive given that I remember incredibly good things about it. It's a flawed game, yet it's brilliant. So how could they have fixed these flaws and left just the brilliance? In my opinion, the single biggest way would be to have a heat mechanic to rein in the use of energy weapons. There's just no downside to them in MechCommander as is. If each mech had a heat bar, perhaps below the health bar that the commander had to monitor, or that the mech warrior would use to indicate that they won't fire their energy weapons for a while, that would give a badly needed use to ballistic and missile weapons. This heat mechanic could also be used to give running a drawback, as heat could slowly build while the mech was both in combat and running. I'm okay with mechs running everywhere when out of combat because, let's be honest here, no one wants to wait 40 minutes for their mechs to slowly ooze to the battlefield. Another way to give running a drawback, or a boon, depending on whether you're shooting or being shot at, is to make walking have less of a chance to hit than standing still, and then make running have even less of a chance to hit, then take into account the motion of the target as well. This would make microing in combat more important, as short-ranged mechs with high armor and low weaponry could become mobile tanks attempting to dodge fire, while longer-ranged mechs take pot shots from a safe distance. This segues nicely into my next point, mech customization. Mechs should use the hardpoint system mentioned earlier to require certain mechs to have the intended flavor, and also to further discourage the overuse of energy weapons. Hunchbacks really aren't hunchbacks if they have medium pulse lasers instead of their heavy autocannon, but it should also be possible to adjust the engines and armor of mechs, as well as indicate where on the mech weapons are located. Mech salvaging should also be less random, which could be solved by making targeted strikes less useless, although possibly more risky. If FASA had made it required to be standing still to specifically hit a leg, which would then have no to-hit penalty or perhaps a very small one, then the mech attempting to capture the other mech would have a significantly higher chance of taking fire. That would then guarantee capturing the enemy mech, and the question then becomes, yes, you captured the mech, but at what cost? And my final point on rectifying the flaws of MechCommander is weapon balance. Different types of weapons should be more of a cross-grade than a direct upgrade. Pulse lasers shouldn't be just better than PPCs, just because they fire more often. They'll generate more heat that way. The heat mechanic gives a vital balancing point to energy weapons and gives them a significant, much-needed downside. With just these few minor adjustments, this game could go from a flawed gem to a true classic. As for why these weren't included, I really don't know. Much of these ideas came from the source material for MechCommander Battletech. It may have been technological limitations, as this game was made in the late 90s, or it could have been an oversight, or perhaps the game was rushed out the door. It's possible that the developers simply didn't notice these issues. Relatively minor things like this are easy to overlook when a developer is too close to a project. It's likely we'll never know why they decided to cut heat, but I think that's really the biggest problem with this game, and it's really pretty minor. So, in conclusion, MechCommander is a game that I think is still very much worth playing. It's a ton of fun to discover the varied and intense missions, and to devise new strategies for beating scenarios that you've already finished. Due to the randomness of the salvaging mechanics, each time you play the game you'll have a unique set of challenges, even though the missions are exactly the same. The AI is dumb, the graphics are dated, the sound is low fidelity, and the game is very, very fun. This is a game that very much deserves a remake with modern technology and, at least in my opinion, the improvements discussed earlier. The game as is isn't even that hard to run on a modern system. I'm running it on Windows 7 64-bit. The 16-bit installer included on the disk just isn't going to work, but that doesn't matter. To install, make a folder where you want to install it. Name it whatever you want. I've named mine MechCommander. Imagine that. Copy all of the files from the disk into the folder you've just made, and the game is installed. To run the executable properly, right-click on it and go to Properties. In the Compatibility tab, check the Run this program in Compatibility Mode for box, and select Windows XP Service Pack 3. Then check Disable Desktop Composition, and run this program as administrator, and the game should run just fine. If you want to run in a resolution greater than 640 by 480, you'll need to open the prefs.cfg file, which I've opened in Notepad. Right above the line that says fit end, add the line L resolution equals 2 to run in 1024 by 768. It's possible to run in 1280 by 1024 by setting your resolution option to 3, but I had a few crashing problems when I tried that. To record properly, I had to be in windowed mode, which you can enter with Alt-Enter, and you can set it to default to windowed mode by changing bDirectDraw to false, as I have, which may have contributed to my crashing. Although, in further testing, it seems that it's just unstable in 1280 by 1024, so you're probably better off running in 1024 by 768. No matter what, though, you're not going to get a widescreen resolution. With MechCommander, and indeed, basically any game from this era, it's 4:3 or bust. If you do make the CFG edit, just be aware that going into the options screen, if you want to change the difficulty or the sound options or whatever, is going to remove the resolution line from the CFG, so you'll have to replace it before you start the game up next time. If you decide you do want to play MechCommander for yourself, it was released by Microsoft for free a few years ago. Just search online and you'll find several places this rather good and incredibly fun game is available. I got the ISO from mechcommander.org a year or two ago, but they seem to have shut down since then. Simply download the ISO from the host of your choice, mount it in the ISO mounter of your choice, I used Daemon Tools Lite, and follow my earlier instructions to get it running on your system, and then have fun playing MechCommander. If you liked the show, click the like or subscribe button. You didn't like the show? Then why are you still watching this? Do you have constructive feedback, or a suggestion for a game that came out from 1995 to 2005 that you think I should examine next? Then leave a comment below, and thank you for watching the pilot episode of Necronalysis. I've been Atraitus, you've been a wonderful audience, and have a fantastic week.